In 1967, one Israeli colonel rewired the command chain of an entire African nation, signing a $7 million arms pact with Uganda's future dictator, Idi Amin. That deal was 15% of Uganda's defense budget and the first domino in a half-century cascade, from shadowy regime change to billion-dollar smuggling operations, from Sudan's secret night convoys to Uganda's blood-soaked runways. Africa's shadow broker isn't spy fiction. It's the raw, documented reality of Mossad's invisible hand guiding wars, coups, and water wars across the Nile Basin. But what pushes an undercover asset to flip nations for cash? And how did forgotten contracts trigger some of Africa's deadliest chain reactions? The answer is buried in the real ledgers, and it starts here. Baruch Bar-Lev arrived in Kampala with a mandate and a checkbook. In 1967, Uganda's military budget was just under $50 million. One contract with Israel, $7 million, consumed 15% of that total. The paperwork spelled out the terms: rifles, mortars, armored vehicles, and a training package for Idi Amin's officer corps. The ink dried on a deal that would send thousands of Israeli weapons into Ugandan barracks and airstrips. Procurement ledgers list more than 2,000 rifles, 120 mortars, and a fleet of armored personnel carriers, all stamped for delivery in less than 12 months. This was not just an arms sale, it was a loyalty purchase. The payment, routed through a Tel Aviv bank, secured not only hardware, but also the presence of Israeli instructors embedded in Ugandan regiments. Training schedules, signed by Bar-Lev, mapped out 6-month rotations for pilots and paratroopers, Uganda's first exposure to Israeli tactics and communications gear. The contract bundled spare parts, ammunition, and a maintenance clause that kept Israeli mechanics on Ugandan soil for years. The $7 million figure dwarfed Uganda's previous foreign military contracts. For comparison, British arms deals with Uganda in the same period rarely broke the $1 million mark. Bar-Lev's offer was structured as a turnkey solution: weapons, training, and technical support, all delivered on a fixed timeline. In exchange, Israel gained access to airfields and intelligence channels deep inside the Nile Basin. Budget records from Uganda's Ministry of Defense show a rapid reallocation of funds, with nearly 1 out of every 6 military shillings redirected to Israeli procurement. The deal's scale triggered a cascade. New uniforms, radio sets, and field equipment arrived by the ton. Israeli kit became the backbone of Uganda's army, from the Presidential Guard down to the lowest infantry unit. Within a year, Israeli arms and expertise had rewired the command structure and set the stage for a new era of power brokering in East Africa. In February 1972, Idi Amin boarded an Israeli jet bound for Libya. The trip, arranged with the same partners who had trained his officer corps, ended with a handshake and a promise from Muammar Gaddafi. Within days, Amin's tone changed. Israeli advisors found themselves locked out of meetings. The Ugandan press, once filled with stories of Israeli-built infrastructure, began running speeches denouncing Zionism. By March, Amin ordered every Israeli, military, technical, and diplomatic, out of Uganda. The last Israeli ambassador, Daniel Laor, packed up the embassy as soldiers watched from the gate. The break wasn't just symbolic. Gaddafi's offer came with hard currency. Contemporary cables put the Libyan cash injection at $25 million, with some later estimates doubling that figure as additional loans and oil credits came through. For Amin, this was more than a windfall. The Ugandan treasury was running dry after the expulsion of the Asian merchant class and the collapse of Western aid. Libyan funds arrived as airlifts of Soviet equipment began to replace Israeli arms in the barracks. The transition was ruthless and fast. Israeli contracts were torn up. Construction crews abandoned half-finished airstrips, bulldozers rumbling across the border into Kenya. Amin's new allies filled the vacuum. Libyan and Soviet advisors moved into barracks once occupied by Israelis. Within 4 years, the same Entebbe airport layout, drawn up by Israeli engineers, would be studied by Mossad planners for a very different purpose. But the loss of Israeli leverage wasn't total. Baruch Bar-Lev's blueprints and training manuals stayed behind, embedded in the Ugandan military's routines. The command structure, rewired by years of Israeli instruction, proved difficult to erase. When the Entebbe hijacking unfolded in 1976, those residual links, old floor plans, radio frequencies, even the cadence of Ugandan patrols, became assets for Israeli intelligence. The $50 million Libyan buy-off bought Amin a new patron, but it could not rewrite the operational DNA left behind in Uganda's security apparatus. The baton passed from private deals to institutional operations, but the shadow of earlier alliances lingered on every runway and radio channel. Arouse village looked like a mirage on Sudan's Red Sea coast. Whitewashed bungalows, a thatched bar, even a fake diving school. The brochures promised European tourists coral reefs and moonlit dinners, but the real traffic moved at night, far from the beach. Mossad's operation here wasn't about leisure. It was about moving thousands of desperate people across one of the world's harshest deserts, using a patchwork of convoys, bribes, and blind luck. The journey began hundreds of miles inland, deep in the Ethiopian highlands. Convoy maps show a 400-mile route west, then north, threading through rebel-held territory and bandit country, ending at Sudan's border. The trek could take anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, depending on the season and the number of children or elderly in the group. Most walked at night, hiding by day to avoid patrols. Armed guides, often little more than bandits themselves, charged steep fees for every checkpoint crossed. Water was the rarest currency. Some groups joined up en route, swelling to 400 or more, but numbers meant little protection. Each new face brought new risks. For Mossad, the logistics were staggering. Over an 18-month window, more than 6,000 evacuees passed through the Eruz pipeline. The operation's price tag eventually topped $100 million, money funneled through Swiss banks, relief agencies, and cash drops along the route. But the cost in lives was far steeper. Of the estimated 10,000 who set out, at least 4,000 died before ever seeing the Red Sea. Some fell to thirst or exhaustion, others were robbed, shot, or simply vanished in the dark. The ratio was brutal. For every 3 who reached the coast, 2 never made it. Convoy schedules were dictated by more than just distance. Sudanese soldiers at the border had to be paid off, local police distracted, and trucks staged for the final leg to the Eruz compound. Any misstep, a missed payment, a wrong turn, could doom hundreds. The illusion of a beach resort masked the grind behind the scenes. Anonymous drivers, cooks, and medics working shifts that blurred into weeks. No headlines marked their efforts. The only evidence left behind was a ledger of names, most crossed out, and a trail of empty water jugs stretching back toward Ethiopia's hills. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything Mossad had attempted in Africa before. Each convoy that reached the coast meant families reunited, but every empty truck returning inland was a reminder of the price paid in the sand. Between November 1984 and January 1985, Trans-European Airways jets lifted nearly 8,000 Ethiopian Jews from Sudanese tarmac to Brussels, then onward to Israel. The flights ran under the radar for weeks, disguised as routine pilgrim charters, each departure carrying close to 200 passengers. 30 flights in total, mapped with military precision, ferried entire families out of the camps where disease and hunger had already claimed thousands. Sudanese officials, bribed and briefed, turned a blind eye as buses rolled up in the darkness and passengers filed up the steps, clutching plastic bags and blankets. The system was built for silence. Mossad planners relied on the anonymity of TEA, an airline known for flying Muslim pilgrims to Mecca, to mask the real passenger lists. The Brussels stopover added another layer, allowing the operation to blend into the flow of international air traffic. But the volume was hard to hide. European journalists picked up rumors of unusual flight patterns, and by late December, wire services were tracking the story. Leaks reached the international press. On January 5, 1985, President Shimon Peres confirmed the operation's existence. The cover was blown. Within hours, Sudan's government, facing outrage from Arab allies, shut down the airlift. The last TEA flight took off with a half-empty cabin, leaving an estimated 1,000 Ethiopian Jews stranded in camps near Gedaref and Port Sudan. Mossad's institutional pipeline, built on logistics, payoffs, and operational discipline, collapsed under the weight of global headlines. The press, in a single news cycle, had done what years of cross-border risk could not. The aftermath was immediate. Sudanese security forces increased patrols, aid groups faced new restrictions, and the remaining refugees disappeared from official lists. For Mossad, the end of the air bridge closed a chapter defined by system over spectacle. The operation's exposure became a case study in how media attention can unravel even the most carefully engineered covert network. The Sudan phase ended not with a failed convoy or a border ambush, but with a front-page story and a forced retreat from the runway. Israel's Ziv's operation was not a relic of Cold War intrigue, but a modern export pipeline, measured in dollars, weapons, and the number of graves left in its wake. The Green Horizon project, launched in 2015, was registered as a farming venture. Its official paperwork promised food security for South Sudan, with contracts for irrigation pivots and banana plantations. But the real traffic ran through a different ledger. Between 2013 and 2018, Ziv, a retired Israeli major general, orchestrated $150 million in arms sales to the South Sudanese government, despite a United Nations embargo, despite a civil war that had already displaced millions. Bank records and customs declarations traced the flow of funds from Juba's Ministry of Defense to Israeli accounts in Tel Aviv. Oil revenue, disguised as agricultural payments, moved through commodity traders and shell firms. The cover story was plausible enough for international banks, but not for investigators who followed the trail to Entebbe's runways and Juba's military warehouses. United Nations serial number audits conducted in 2015 and 2016 identified Galil Ace-32 rifles, Israeli-made, 7.62 by 39 millimeter, with manufacturing dates matching Ziv's contract windows, stockpiled by South Sudan's National Security Service. These rifles did not stay in government armories. Eyewitness testimony and photographic evidence confirmed their transfer to the Mathiang Anior militia, a force loyal to President Salva Kiir and infamous for its role in the December 2013 Juba massacre. On the streets of Juba, the first shots of the civil war were fired by men carrying Israeli rifles. The United Nations panel of experts documented the chain of custody. Ace-32s delivered to the Presidential Guard, distributed to Mathiang Anior units, then used in house-to-house killings that targeted Nur civilians. The massacre left hundreds dead in a matter of days and ignited a conflict that would claim an estimated 400,000 lives. Survivors described the weapons by name, galaxies, and recounted how government trucks delivered crates of new rifles in the hours before the violence began. Forensic analysis of shell casings and recovered rifles matched serial numbers to shipments cleared through Ugandan customs, routed via Entebbe with paperwork signed by Ziv's companies. The Green Horizon pipeline operated in plain sight, protected by diplomatic ambiguity and the complexity of international arms law. Israeli export licenses, granted under the guise of agricultural support, were never revoked, even as reports of atrocities mounted. Ziv's network included not just weapons but surveillance technology. Verint Systems, an Israeli firm, inked a $762,000 contract with South Sudan's National Security Service in 2015, providing interception equipment that allowed security forces to monitor opposition leaders, journalists, and aid workers. The surveillance system was paid for by mandatory fees levied on all telecom operators in South Sudan, with receipts deposited directly into Verint's accounts. The profits flowed upstream. Ziv's companies drew millions in consulting fees and equipment markups. Israeli Weapon Industries, the manufacturer of the ACE-32, expanded its African operations, opening new offices and securing additional contracts with presidential guards across the region. The South Sudanese government, flush with oil cash and international loans, funneled resources into weapons and wiretaps, while famine warnings flashed across United Nations bulletins. For every dollar spent on irrigation equipment, 5 more went to rifles, ammunition, and surveillance gear. The paper trail is clear. $150 million in arms, thousands of Galil Ace-ITS rifles, and a surveillance network that turned South Sudan's security services into an instrument of total control. The massacre in Juba was not an accident of war, but the result of a supply chain engineered for profit and influence. The Green Horizon Project, on paper a solution to hunger, became a pipeline for weapons that fueled one of Africa's deadliest conflicts. The receipts, stamped and signed, remain in the archives, evidence of a business model where humanitarian branding masked the mechanics of massacre. A $762,000 contract signed in 2015 between Verint Systems and South Sudan's National Security Service delivered the technical infrastructure for a new kind of control. The deal, paid for by mandatory levies on every telecom operator in the country, equipped the security services with interception gear capable of monitoring calls, texts, and data traffic in real time. Receipts from Vivatel and MTN, 2 of South Sudan's largest mobile providers, show payments routed directly to Verint's accounts for technical services. Within months, government agents could listen in on opposition leaders, journalists, and humanitarian workers. Court records and human rights reports document how intercepted conversations were read back to detainees during interrogations, proof that the surveillance system was not just operational but central to the government's campaign against dissent. Corporate contracts like this one rarely make headlines, but their impact is felt in every corner of Juba. The National Security Service, flush with oil revenue and protected by diplomatic ambiguity, used Israeli technology to build a listening state. The system's reach extended beyond political opponents. Aid organizations reported that staff phones were routinely tapped, and journalists described a climate of fear where every call might be monitored. The $762,000 spent on Verint's equipment represented a fraction of South Sudan's security budget, yet it delivered a strategic advantage worth far more: the ability to anticipate, disrupt, and silence opposition before it could mobilize. Irrigation contracts followed a similar logic, though on a different scale. The Green Horizon Food Security Project, managed by Israeli consultants, installed pivot and drip irrigation systems on nearly 450 hectares at Jebel Ladu Farm and New Land Farm. These projects, valued in the millions, promised to transform South Sudan's agricultural output. Water pumped from the Nile, 200,000 cubic meters at Jebel Ladu alone, fed new banana plantations and vegetable fields. Ministry officials praised the efficiency of Israeli irrigation technology, calling it a game changer for food security. But the numbers told a different story. For every dollar spent on irrigation, 5 more flowed into weapons, ammunition, and surveillance contracts. The Green Horizon Project's paperwork listed food security as its mission, yet customs records tracked shipments of rifles and radio jammers alongside fertilizer and seed. The strategic value of these contracts lay not just in technology transfer, but in the leverage they created upstream. Israel's expertise in water management shaped how and where Nile water was diverted, with every hectare of irrigated land upstream reducing the flow downstream to Egypt. In Ethiopia, a $200 million Entebbe project covered 7,000 hectares of sugarcane along the Blue Nile, with Israeli engineers managing water allocation and flow rates. Egyptian officials estimated that Israeli-backed projects upstream had already reduced Nile flow by up to 15% since 2018, threatening agriculture and livelihoods for millions downstream. The numbers were stark. Egypt's annual water deficit grew by billions of cubic meters, while Israeli companies collected consulting fees and technical control over critical infrastructure. These contracts, signed in boardrooms and ministries, redefined the balance of power along the Nile. Surveillance systems and irrigation pivots became tools of influence, allowing foreign actors to shape not just what was grown or said, but who could speak and who would eat. The receipts: $762,000 for Verint, $200 million for Netafim, millions more for Green Horizon, trace a pattern of corporate deals that doubled as instruments of statecraft. In the shadow of war and famine, technology became the currency of control. Every intercepted call, every diverted liter of water reinforced a new reality. The future of the Nile Basin would be decided not only by armies or diplomats, but by the quiet reach of contracts and the silent logic of surveillance and flow. In 1967, Israeli operatives brokered a $7 million arms deal, equal to 15% of Uganda's defense budget, setting in motion a chain of covert interventions across the Nile Basin. Declassified cables, procurement ledgers, and United Nations serial logs reveal a half-century of shifting tactics, from Baruch Bar-Lev's personal leverage over Idi Amin to the $100 million logistics behind Mossad's Arouse resort and the 6,000 lives extracted through desert convoys. By 2013, the model evolved. Over $150 million in arms and surveillance contracts, documented by United Nations sanctions and Treasury reports, flowed to conflicts that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the full scope of institutional decision-making, including details on the $200 million Netafim irrigation deal, remains partly classified. What is clear, the techniques, arms, logistics, technology, first tested in Uganda and Sudan, now shape the region's power over water, borders, and survival. The archives show a pattern: influence bought, traded, and leveraged, leaving legacies in both the open ledgers and the classified files that remain sealed.